Welcome to History 225. I'm Barry Maxwell. We'll be talking about the U.S. national interest involved in Iraq, specifically centering around events that led up to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. First, let's talk about the national interest in general, a large part of what drove that whole issue. National interests are relatively long-term, big picture, really important general things that are very important to a nation or a country. Things like, commonly, survival as a country. Nobody likes being invaded. Control of their territory. Nobody likes being told what to do by outsiders. A close second is welfare, especially economic. Hard to keep people interested in doing much of anything if they don't have a job and are starving to death. Usually third, although sometimes this takes precedent, is things that the people of that country might widely believe in, such as shared values, aspirations to do something. Issues such as nationalism will sometimes work their way into this. Feelings of broad shared history, feeling downtrodden as an ethnicity or a religious group may work their way here too. But often it's values about something or other. In the U.S., values about democracy and liberty are pretty big. Might also be, depending on who you're talking to, about leaders staying in power. That people may not agree with that, but leaders calling the shots may define the national interest as in what keeps them in power. So, for the most part, think of these national interests as broad situations that we would like to have happen, conditions that we would like, and not so much a goal or a specific thing to be accomplished, but rather the way we would like things to be. So who says what they are? Well, that kind of varies. Certainly leaders have their say, so do voters, other interest groups. And another big question, which ones are vital? You'll often hear the reference to vital national interest. Usually something that the people in the country are willing to fight and kill for. Probably it's vital. So national objectives are shorter term things that might need to be done, specific goals or actions that the state might want to take to further these national interests, to get to those situations and conditions that they like. And exactly what these are going to be modified by threats to the national interests that emerge. Maybe they've always been there. Maybe there's new threats. Things like a potential invader. Things like national resources running out or being cut off. Threats to trade, threats to the economy. Also, opportunities sometimes show up. Some new alliance partner that has appeared, or a new trade partner that has shown up, new national resources that are discovered, or someone else discovers theirs and may be willing to trade. And then, of course, there's the capabilities that a country brings to considering these things, which certainly influence what they're going to try and do. It's pretty silly to try and do something that you don't have the capability to do. Now, one can develop new capabilities, and that's sometimes thought about and worked on. So these objectives, hard to agree on because you have different groups within a country that have different ideas about what ought to be going on, and sometimes they have different values, and these might get in the way of each other. I have some very focused on domestic things, groups that feel threatened by trade, don't believe it's going to help them out. Others think trade or foreign issues might be very important to the nation's future, and so they might clash on that. Some maybe view human rights as the overriding concern. Others trade and the economy more important and willing to trade with partners that maybe aren't so good on human rights. Certainly a big debate about the U.S. and China currently. Another thing that might come up, especially in the U.S., big believers in democracy, yet maybe our security might require alliance with partners that aren't so good on democracy or human rights. Unpleasant choices often made during the Cold War especially. Freedom, personal freedom versus security for all, certainly another trade-off that often has to be made. And so these are hard to prioritize. Different groups within the state, again, might have competing interests. And again, who defines? The executive might have their view. Presidents want certain things. Their legislatures may want something else. Interest groups that influence and help get those leaders into power may have a third thing they want. And then there's always public opinion, possibly expressed by voters or by other means, such as coups or rebellions in some cases. So always a good clue to look at is what do these groups need to be able to stay in power or gain success for whatever it is they're trying to do. Certainly a good indicator of what they may push for. So a graphic to just kind of lay out how all these things fit together, and a little more about what those capabilities are in a minute as we look for a way to categorize them. So one thing to define with these capabilities, they are not the same as having power over others. Capabilities are just an ability to do something, but that doesn't necessarily get you the ability to make others behave the way you want. So power we're going to define as the ability to influence others to do something that you want. So to make that happen, those others, whoever they are, need to both understand your capability and believe that you're really going to use it. And finally, believe that whatever it is you want them to do is more pleasant than the alternative that you're offering them if you have to use one of these capabilities on them in a coercive way. Understanding that what you want them to do may be more than they're willing to put up with. They may be willing to fight and die rather than give in to something that you want, even though you appear to have the capability to make life very hard for them. So this power then is relative to who's involved and what their interests are. Having a big army doesn't necessarily mean you can get somebody to do what you want, for example, or if you've got lots of money or whatever. So some of these capabilities that may give states power over others, I say may, emphasizing that, in the political realm, the ability to persuade others, make deals, put together coalitions, economic and technological capabilities. You may have lots of money, may have all sorts of trade advantages, may have the ability to control the world's reserve currency, such as the U.S. can. May have big technological advantages as far as fast communications, ability to make decisions quickly. Geographic capabilities. Those might be things from your location, being very close to something that's useful, or the disadvantage of being very far away, for example. Geographic capabilities might include natural resources such as local oil, local water, mountain ranges that might protect you, open plains that might allow an invader to come in, and so on. Military capabilities get looked at a lot. Again, I'll emphasize that it's not just counting up the number of tanks and airplanes and soldiers that you have. It's how well you can use them. As we saw in the Arab-Israeli conflict opening days, numbers aren't the only thing involved. And again, your ability to use it also means your willingness to use it. And this can be expensive in lives and treasure, and voters have limited patience for using up either of those. And then there's a social, cultural, and religious power, or capabilities rather, that you may have. American culture, while some may deride it, is looked up to by many in the world, emulated by many, which gives the U.S. a certain ability to influence others. So, moving on specifically to the Middle East. Starting off with the security of the U.S. And its citizens. And again, we're focusing in on 2003, the year that President Bush decided to invade Iraq. And we're going to be looking at how that came about. So, threats to the U.S. homeland is always a big deal. And also to our allies. Without our allies, we'd be alone. If we really needed help, it wouldn't be there. So you got to kind of take care of your allies, at least to some extent. And we've got several in that region. Israel, probably the first and foremost, that we've made oral and public commitments to defend. Being very vague about how we do that, but that we're going to have their back, quote unquote. Kuwait, who we did actually defend some 25 years ago almost. Saudi Arabia, that we've also worked to defend. None of which we have actual formal defense treaties with, but again have made commitments and spent a lot of time and energy being ready to defend. So how does Iraq fit into this? Well, it had a lot of potential capabilities. Again, not necessarily power, but capabilities. I'll also point out that capabilities mean you could do something. They don't mean you will. And so intent and what you are going to do are a separate question that we'll look at in a minute. So Iraqi capabilities. Some were not too clear at the time. Possibly weapons of mass destruction, maybe nuclear weapons, or the ability to contaminate others with nuclear dust or some such. Chemical weapons, biological weapons to make people sick, missiles to deliver them, or just explosives further away than just a few miles. In 2003, their capability to do these things was unknown. Inspectors had left back in 1998, and it had been a number of years since anyone had been there really checking on what they were doing. And as we know from the Long Road to War documentary, Iraq under Saddam had quite a history of developing such weapons, hiding them, lying about them, and not clear what was going on at the current time. But it was assumed, I can tell you, from having worked in the Carter administration, the Clinton administration, that it was just assumed that Iraq had these capabilities. And assuming that, it was easy to find evidence that took place. So not something that the Bush administration, which came afterwards, fabricated on its own, although we might fault them for not double-checking better. Terrorism. Certainly something in 2003 Americans were very concerned about in the shadow of the big 9/11 attacks just a couple years earlier. A lot of suspicion that Iraq under Saddam had some hand in this. We do know that the Iraqi government had some contacts with al-Qaeda, but we're also reasonably sure now that they had no hand in coordinating the 9/11 attacks. Though there had been some suspicions that could have taken place, turned out it had not. But nonetheless, concerned that Saddam was the kind of guy that might support such things and had supported other terrorist groups, especially Palestinian ones opposing Israel. And there's always the possibility of invasion with Army, Air Force. Not much of a concern for the U.S. homeland, but certainly for our regional partners. All three of these either border or are not very far away from Iraq. And we'll look at the history in a minute for why everyone might have had a concern that this could occur in the future. So, quick look at Iraq and some military history. First, though, in this blue circle, some 20% of the world's oil is produced and put on ships to be sent to other parts of the world. That's a huge amount, significant for the world economy. Oil is a fundamental resource for the entire world economy. Every country in the world uses it. Most do not produce enough of it on their own and have to buy it from others, although not all. So, within this circle, and with this history, we saw Saddam as president of Iraq, not some other president, but him personally, do a number of things. Invaded Iran in 1980, and then Kuwait 10 years later in 1990. Invasion into Iran shown here, invasion into Kuwait 10 years later. Subsequent to that second invasion, you saw Iraq launching missiles into Israel and Saudi Arabia, shown here and here. Arguably might not have happened had his invasion of Kuwait not been imposed by the U.S.-led coalition, but it was. So again, quite a bit of hardware being launched into other countries to kill people over a relatively short period of time. So because he did that these times doesn't necessarily mean he would do it in the future, but when you don't know for sure, if you look at somebody's capability and what they've done with it in the past, not an unreasonable criteria for what might be done in the future. And getting more specific, had actually used chemical weapons, used them against Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, used them against the Kurds during an uprising, his people in his own country, so didn't have reluctance to use chemical weapons. So a lot of concern that if he had nuclear and biological weapons, why would he hesitate to use those as well? And we know he'd had extensive weapons of mass destruction programs, as outlined in the Road to War documentary, both nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons. Did a really good job of hiding these multiple times from various inspectors from the United Nations throughout the 1980s and 1990s. So it was assumed that he was hiding these as well as we move into the early 2000s. And again, support for Palestinian terrorist groups in terms of providing some amount of money, some training. Not a huge backer, but again, somewhat. Doesn't necessarily mean he'd back others, but wouldn't mean he wouldn't either. So again, a lot of concern about Iraq as we move into 2002, 2003 timeframe. So other areas of interest. I mentioned oil, and what a big part of the world supply comes out of this area, including to and adjacent to Iraq, which includes a huge part of the European and Japanese imports. Those economies would not function without the oil they get from this part of the world. I want to remember that these are Western Europe with its NATO members, and the Japanese are both alliance partners with the U.S., NATO, and specifically Japan with a written defense treaty that we've got. And they're also significant trade partners that we sell a lot of stuff to, buy a lot of stuff from, and that would certainly all be disrupted if their economies were brought to their knees by a huge cut in their oil supplies. The U.S. specifically, not nearly as dependent on Persian Gulf oil, maybe something around 10% or so. A significant part, and certainly the loss of that would be a big deal, but the loss to other people in the world would be a much bigger deal to the U.S. Now, Saudi Arabia alone is almost 15% of the world's supply, or was back then. And, as a product of the sanctions put in place in 1990 after Iraq invaded Kuwait, after that war is over, the U.S. must maintain a military presence in Saudi Arabia to be able to police the no-fly zone and police the sanctions. But many Saudis didn't like having a foreign military stationed on their soil. That was one of Osama bin Laden's big complaints. One of the things that drove him to form Al-Qaeda and oppose the U.S. In its worldwide activities. So the U.S. desire to eventually not have to do that anymore, not be there anymore, was something both the U.S. and the Saudis really wanted to bring about if they could, but couldn't as long as the problems with Iraq were continuing. Add to this, Iraq has a geologic potential to provide huge amounts of oil, and very cheaply. It's high-quality oil. It's relatively cheap to get at if, and it's a big if, things calm down enough there to bring in the right technology to develop and harvest those resources, which so far hasn't happened. But if Saudi Arabia were ever to have significant problems internally, say coups, domestic unrest, which Al-Qaeda threatened it with shortly after, around the time this invasion happened, and seriously threatened its oil production, be nice to have some alternatives, and Iraq was viewed as one future possibility for that. So, but while Iraq was under Saddam, again, all that oil production is certainly within Iraqi striking distance to disrupt it, which would have devastated the world economy. Much worse than the Great Recession of 2008. Think of the Great Depression of 1930s or worse. And the U.S., even if it developed its own oil resources, even if we cut back on our usage, would still be hugely affected by this. So, moving on to the third big area of U.S. National interest. Americans have always had a big belief in the value of democracy, of liberty, human rights. Doesn't always look like it, but we like to believe that we value this, and often we do. And we're often willing to spend some amount of money and even some lives to bring it to other places, at times anyway. coupled with a belief that the world is safer the more democracies there are. This idea that democracies don't invade each other, that it takes a dictator to make that happen, that they don't breed terrorists. There's something to that. And so this desire to spread democracy to make the world safer for us, especially as a response to the 9/11 sort of terrorism that we're still coping with. Coupled, again, also with a U.S. view of history. Americans like to see themselves as liberators of oppressed people. Our view of history has a lot of examples where we think we did that. The Spanish-American War, where we're freeing the Spanish oppressed Cubans and Filipinos, freeing the Germans from totalitarianism, especially Hitler, freeing Japan, South Korea, other Cold War examples of Vietnam and liberation of Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union, freeing Kuwait from Saddam in 1990. Again, you get the narrative that we've got in mind. And Iraq under Saddam was viewed as a dictator. Certainly wasn't elected in any real sense, and certainly a human rights abuser and torturer par excellence. So this idea that maybe the U.S. could bring democracy to the Arab world, especially Iraq, but that might have to be done through military means. So, looking at the timeline, I'll leave you to the previous Cold War presentation, and especially and importantly, the Long Road to War Democracy documentary for a history that will bring you up to September of 2002 about U.S. and Iraq. So as the documentary ends, you have President Bush making his famous speech to the United Nations in September of 2002, laying out the case for why Iraq was such a threat to world security, but willing to work with the UN if possible to try and do something about that rather than go it alone. However, wanting to strengthen his hand, he asks and gets from Congress a bipartisan vote to authorize the use of force or whatever means necessary to protect U.S. security vis-a-vis Iraq. And you see the very one-sided votes that authorize that. So it wasn't just Republicans that brought this about. A lot of Democrats voted for this in both houses. An open-ended blank check, yeah, but they authorized it. So, given this, the U.S. begins a military buildup in the Persian Gulf, mainly in Kuwait, to some extent Qatar, a little further down the coast, and begins the serious work with the UN, crafting Resolution 1441, which is unanimously voted on by the UN Security Council, as the date indicated, mainly saying that, okay, Iraq, you've got one more chance to give us all information about your WMD. Number one, let inspectors in within 90 days with free access to wherever they want to go, or you will face serious consequences. Never defined, but seen as something serious, maybe military, not quite spelled out, as often such documents don't. December, Iraq replies, says, sure, we have no WMDs. We keep telling you that. They cough up a bunch of documents. Turns out to be pretty much stuff that was already known, so U.S. is suspicious that they're still hiding things, believing that there were a number of weapon systems that were never accounted for after the inspectors left in 1998. U.S. and British military buildup continues, reaching about 200,000 troops south of Iraq. January rolls around. The UN inspectors are allowed in to Iraq and begin the slow process of inspections, and are allowed to go pretty much wherever they want. Understanding, though, that Iraq is the size of California, and it's a lot can be hidden, and many believe that things were being hidden. Hard to prove, but there was just enough evidence of them hiding something, and it was assumed to be weapons of mass destruction. The case was being built that they were evading the sanctions and inspections. One glitch in the inspectors was that while they could go where they wanted, they didn't have much luck getting Iraqi scientists to talk to them. Many refused to talk about what they had done, what they were doing, again making it difficult to verify what was really going on. Inspectors complained, and the Iraqi government said, "Hey, not our problem. Well, we're not our fault if they don't feel like talking to you." So that was an impasse that was never really resolved. A few things are found: some very old, rusty chemical weapons, some missiles that were somewhat in excess of the legal range, but nothing significant as far as actual weaponized systems. And the U.S. military buildup continues, reaching about 250,000 by March. U.S. and the British are convinced that Saddam is just hiding stuff, and attempts to get a new, more specific Security Council resolution specifically authorizing the use of force, claiming that Iraq is not complying with the UN resolution previously voted on. Colin Powell, the U.S. Secretary of State, makes a famous speech at the UN, making the case that here's the evidence, they're hiding stuff. Here's the radio intercepts where they talk about evading the inspectors, hiding things from the inspectors. So that's why we believe they're hiding things. Now, this resolution is opposed by the French, among others, to a lesser extent Germany, Russia, and a few others that also believe that Iraq has such weapons, but wants more time for the inspectors to keep looking before they feel okay about an invasion. Now, they're not the ones that are going to do it. The U.S. is. The U.S. very concerned about this dragging on until the summer months. And the U.S. Army very concerned about having to do an invasion into Iraq during the desert summers and the great heat, especially wearing all the chemical protective gear, gas masks and whatnot. Again, the U.S. Army convinced that these chemical weapons will be used on them during an invasion. So, can't quite get the votes. The French lobby hard against it. U.S. lobbies for it. They need 9. They can't get any more than 8, so they just pull the resolution off the table. Decide that the previous resolution is good enough with its threat of serious consequences. So the U.S. and Britain, with a number of other allies, although not including the French, invade in that March. So, why do we think that President Bush did this? Well, hard to know for sure. We can pick up bits and pieces from speeches that were made leading up to it, and some of the things that various participants have written and talked about afterwards. So here's my estimation of what was going on. One of the biggest concern was removing Saddam as an unpredictable and dangerous regional actor. This is the guy, not somebody else, the guy that had ordered the invasion of Iraq in 1980, Kuwait in 1990, missiles in 91, and a whole host of other things that were deemed to be real problems. It was also believed that there'd be big human rights benefits from removing him. And how could the people not treat the U.S. as a liberator if they free them from this horrible dictator? Which initially they do, but that doesn't last too long. And eventually we do come to be seen as an invader by at least a significant minority of Iraqis. Another goal, remove or at least verify that there aren't any weapons of mass destruction and remove any threat of future WMD by making sure there's no capability to make more. That is actually done, although not quite the way that was planned. The idea of bringing Iraq democracy, which could then be an example to other Arab states, as a way to deal with Islamic terrorism. One popular theory being that it was the authoritarian Arab states that had so much political discontent that some turned to Islamic terrorism as a way to get back at a lack of political input. And not clear that this has worked out very well so far. The Arab Spring, maybe some think might be a possibility of this, but that's not working out yet. We'll see what happens. The sanctions on Iraq can be dropped. Free trade could be opened with them. And the previously mentioned disruptive U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia would no longer be needed, so can be removed. And that was achieved. There was this feeling that Iraq under Saddam was the biggest military threat to Israel. And as long as it existed, that Israel would not feel secure enough to make peace with the Palestinians. which was an assumption. And for about a year and a half or so after the invasion, great inroads were almost made. So it looked like that was a good bet, but couldn't put it together, and still hasn't made a decisive difference, although it seemed like a good idea at the time. And the business about being able to eventually increase Iraqi oil production, not yet. The idea was that more market supply would make oil cheaper for the whole world, help out all the world's economies, not just the U.S. Cheaper fuel allows more people to do more things was the idea, and as mentioned, that potential alternative to Saudi oil, just in case something bad happened in Saudi Arabia, the world wouldn't be quite so dependent on that. And you may be able to think of other reasons why this invasion seemed like a good idea at the time. Now, at the time, when it was being considered, many did predict problems, some of which happened, many of which didn't. I recall a lot of discussion about, oh my, there'll be, all this fighting within cities. City fighting's ugly. Yes, it is. American armor and air power won't be of much use inside the cities. Yeah, that can be a problem, but it doesn't happen. The Iraqi army just melts away. So other than some insurgents, there really isn't much organized resistance on the part of the Iraqis. Likewise, the ground war moves so fast that civilians don't even have time to pick up and try and get away from the fighting. It just moves past them, and they stay in place, so you don't get a big refugee problem as was feared. It was also feared that Arabs in other countries so mad that we'd invaded a fellow Arab nation that there'd be big riots, governments would be stabilized, oil production disturbed, with economic problems. And while there are some short-term protests, not really that big a deal, as it turns out. Another concern that was hotly debated was Iraq a group that could function without the dictator Saddam holding the pieces together. Many Iraqis argued that no, we can work it out without him. Let us have a try at it. We can do it. Others contending that no, with the dictator gone, the different ethnic groups will be fighting with each other, and Iraq will just fragment into separate pieces: a Kurdish piece, a Shia piece, a Sunni Arab piece. And this probably turned out to be relatively accurate. Hasn't happened yet, but it could well, and appears to be in progress at this point. We'll see. Some concern that as an invader, that even though we thought we were a liberator, that local Iraqis would see us as invaders and fight us. Not initially, but for a variety of reasons, at least on the part of the Sunni Arabs, to some extent comes to pass. You get a fairly significant insurgency. The place almost becomes ungovernable. The U.S. is able to work things out to a large extent. A lot of people killed, especially Americans, several thousand out of that. But things are to some extent worked out by 2008, 2009 or so. Things look like they're headed in a good direction. But by the time we leave, maybe not so much. Does strain the U.S. alliances. There was a lot of enmity between the U.S. government and the French government over all of this. We're NATO allies and theoretically cooperating, but didn't agree on that. So that was rather short-term, and things are much better between us now, so not a long-term problem. Some ideas that this might distract us from bigger problems and from North Korea or Al-Qaeda. Maybe. Again, the forces used in Iraq weren't what you'd need for these other problem areas, so not so sure that was a big problem. And you may think of other problems that were predicted in your research or looking at this. So, a view from today, just to wrap things up. When it was all said and done, and the inspectors after Saddam and his army were gone, when we had access to everything, and actually the scientists would finally talk to us now, what was revealed was they had actually gotten rid of all the weapons in the late 1990s. And so there weren't any more. But The reason they wouldn't talk to the inspectors was that there were significant plans and research that had been done to develop and produce new weapons of mass destruction as soon as the UN sanctions and inspectors had gone. So Saddam did have plans to reinstitute them, but was not ever able to carry them out because he got removed. So to this day, Iraq not a strategic threat to much of anyone. So the Sunni Arab minority does continue, as we speak, to feel disadvantaged and marginalized by a Shia majority government in this emerging democracy. So there's been an intermittent insurgency going on, which is picking up speed now, as his terrorist groups that are emanating from there into Syria, possibly other places. We'll see. And the democracy continues to be marginal and very fragile in nature, with many not feeling that it represents them, although probably the majority might think that it does. Shia, Iran, next door, has considerable influence with the Shia government in Iraq, despite there being the difference between Iran being Persian, Iraqis being Arab. The Shia bonds seem to be stronger in this case for now. And the U.S., with no troops in the country, they all left in 2011, has somewhat less influence, for better or for worse. As mentioned, political instability continues. The government is largely ethnically partitioned, with the goodies mostly going to the Shia. Sunni feeling left out of the government, left out of benefits, feeling like they're not getting support and things that they ought to have, which has left a government that's not quite as competent as we might wish. Electricity, kind of a problem, so the rest of the economy is having difficulties, and they've had a lot of trouble developing their oil resources anywhere near to their potential. I think they finally managed to get it production back up to above invasion levels, but not yet back to what the production levels were before the UN sanctions were imposed in 1990. So, the future of the country is uncertain. So, thanks for listening.